They called it justice. But in ancient Greece, justice sometimes wore the mask of cruelty. A bronze bull hollow inside its belly lit by fire, where screams twisted into the bellow of an animal. Not myth, but method. Who truly paid the price for the city's order and the tyrant's power? Chronicles give us fragments. Archaeology and bitter texts complete the rest. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the screams still echo. Punishment in ancient Greece was never just about ending a life. It was about sending a message. From the bustling agora to the hidden chambers of tyrants' execution could be as carefully staged as a play. Power was not only enforced through armies and laws, but through spectacle designed to make citizens tremble at the sight, the sound, even the rumor of what awaited those who crossed the line. The most chilling symbol of this theater of pain was the Brazen Bull, a device born from human imagination and perfected into a machine of terror. Invented by Perelaos, offered to the tyrant Phalaris of Akragas, it was a punishment that turned human agony into sound. The condemned were locked inside, roasted alive, and their screams forced through pipes that transformed them into the roaring of a beast. It was not only execution, it was performance. The crowd did not just witness death. They heard it distorted into music of horror, a grotesque symphony of authority. And yet, the Brazen Bull was not an isolated horror. It was only the beginning of a darker truth that Greek civilization, while celebrated for democracy, philosophy, and art, also engineered punishments with a precision that rivaled its temples and theaters. Each punishment, whether by flamestone or poison, was both practical and symbolic, shaping society through fear as much as law. This series will uncover those punishments not as curiosities, but as windows into a culture where honor, shame, and control often outweighed mercy, where the state's power over the body became a lesson for every citizen who dared to dream of disobedience. The Brazen Bull was more than a device. It was a philosophy cast in bronze. Its story begins in Akragas, a Greek colony in Sicily, during the 6th century BCE, under the rule of the tyrant Phalaris. Like many rulers who rose to power through fear, Phalaris understood that domination required more than soldiers. It required symbols. And few symbols could equal what an Athenian craftsman named Perelaos offered him: a machine that transformed death into theatre. Perelaos presented his invention with pride, claiming it to be a humane execution. In truth, it was nothing less than engineered cruelty. The design was simple but chilling. The bull was a hollow statue large enough to contain a human body. A trapdoor opened on its side, where the condemned was locked inside. Beneath its belly, fires were stoked until the bronze glowed red hot. Slowly, the victim roasted alive, their flesh seared against the metal. Their lungs burned as superheated air filled the chamber. But the most grotesque detail lay not in the fire, but in the sound. Perelaos had crafted a system of pipes and acoustic tubes in the bull's nostrils and mouth. These distorted the victim's screams, twisting human agony into the roaring bellow of a beast. To the audience, it seemed as if the bull itself were alive, enraged and crying out. The device made suffering not only visible, but audible, turning pain into performance. Diodorus Siculus, a historian writing in the 1st century BCE, recounts the tale with disgust, but he also reveals the irony of its first demonstration. When Perelaos offered the bull to Phalaris, the tyrant asked for a test. Perillus himself was ordered inside. As the fire licked at the bronze, and his screams echoed as the bull's roar, Phalaris stopped the spectacle, only to drag Perillus out, then executed him anyway. The inventor became the first victim of his own creation. The Brazen Bull was never just about execution. It was about authority. To burn a man alive inside a golden beast was to declare that the tyrant's power reached beyond life, beyond dignity, into the realm of sound and symbol. The condemned ceased to be human and became a prop in the ruler's theatre of terror. Nor was this cruelty unique to Akragas. Across the ancient world, rulers found ways to engineer death as message. In Persia, impalement turned rebellion into a grotesque display lining city gates. In Rome, crucifixion stretched the agony of the condemned across days, making their suffering into public policy. In Carthage, children were rumoured, perhaps slanderously, perhaps truthfully, to be burned alive in sacrifice to Baal. Their cries carried over the city walls as proof of devotion. The Brazen Bull fit into this continuum pain as propaganda. What makes the bull stand out, however, is its precision. It was not a rough improvisation of cruelty, but a crafted machine designed with the same ingenuity that built temples and theatres. Where architects channeled acoustics to carry a singer's voice to the back of an amphitheatre, Perillus twisted that knowledge to amplify the cries of the dying. Greek artistry. The same culture that carved marble into gods and painted vases with myth was here bent toward horror. We should not imagine, though, that such devices were daily tools of justice. The bull was exceptional, its story half legend and half history, but its meaning was clear. Justice in the hands of a tyrant could be reshaped into spectacle. When words failed, when laws were not enough, rulers relied on terror embodied. The victim's agony was not wasted. It was consumed, converted into sound, into memory, into fear that lingered long after the fire cooled. Archaeology has never uncovered the remains of the bull itself, but the absence of evidence does not erase the lesson. The story endured for centuries, not because of the device's metal, but because of its symbolism. To later writers, the bull became shorthand for tyranny, a reminder that power without restraint feeds on cruelty. To the people who may have witnessed it, the lesson was more direct. The ruler's will was absolute, and the line between citizen and victim could be crossed with a single accusation. The Brazen Bull stands as one of history's darkest metaphors. It asks us not just how far a ruler would go to enforce authority, but how easily human skill, artcraft, ingenuity can be turned toward suffering. In that sense, it is not only a tale of ancient cruelty, it is a warning for every age that prides itself on its sophistication. What we create reflects who we are, and when cruelty becomes art, civilization itself begins to roar with the sound of the bull. Not all punishments in ancient Greece relied on fire or iron. Some were designed not merely to hurt the body, but to annihilate dignity, to make the condemned a walking reminder of shame. Among the strangest and most unsettling was raphanadosis, a punishment that seems almost absurd at first mention, yet reveals how humiliation itself could become a state-sanctioned weapon. The details come to us most vividly through the comedies of Aristophanes. In The Clouds 423 BCE, amid satire and ridicule, he refers to raphanadosis as a penalty for adultery. The punishment, he joked, involved the forced insertion of a radish into the rectum of the condemned. To a modern ear, this sounds like grotesque theatre, perhaps too bizarre to be real. Yet, the very fact that Aristophanes could reference it so casually suggests that his audience knew the practice well enough to laugh or wince in recognition. The scholiasts later, ancient commentators, support the notion that raphanadosis may have been more than metaphor. It may have been inflicted, at least in rare cases, on men guilty of adultery or other violations of sexual norms. Why such a punishment? Because in Athens, as in many Greek polis, honor was as vital as breath. A man's reputation determined his standing in the community, his ability to command respect in the assembly, or even to defend himself in court. To be humiliated publicly was a form of social death. Raphanadosis was not designed to kill, but to disgrace, to mark the condemned as unmanly, violated, and unworthy of civic trust. In a culture obsessed with masculine virtue and self-restraint, sophrosine, this punishment inverted the hierarchy, stripping the offender of all claims to honor. Humiliation was the true sentence. Physical pain would fade, but the memory lingered in laughter, in whispers, in the collective judgment of neighbors. For Athenians who lived in a society where the community's opinion could decide elections, lawsuits, and alliances, to be publicly mocked was to be politically crippled. A man shamed through raphanadosis was unlikely ever to regain his footing in civic life. And it was not the only humiliation-based punishment. Other comic poets mention the use of fig branches or other implements in similar ways, reinforcing the blend of ridicule and pain. Ostracism, though bloodless, functioned with the same principle, casting someone out of the city not for physical crimes, but for moral or political untrustworthiness. Public shaming was as real a penalty as chains. There is too a darker undertone. The body in Athens was a metaphor for the state. A violated body symbolized a violation of order itself. Adulterers threatened the sanctity of marriage, which in turn threatened inheritance, citizenship, and the stability of the polis. To punish adultery with humiliation was to dramatize this violation before the community. The act said you have polluted not only yourself, but the civic body, and so your body will bear the mark of disgrace. Modern readers might question whether raphanadosis was widespread, or whether Aristophanes exaggerated for comic effect. Historians remain divided, yet the laughter of an audience is itself a form of evidence. Jokes land only when they strike a chord of recognition. And so whether or not every adulterer endured the radish, the threat was part of the cultural landscape. Fear of ridicule could regulate behavior as effectively as law. In this way, raphanadosis reminds us that punishments need not be spectacular to be devastating. The brazen bull burned flesh into ash, crucifixion nailed defiance into silence. But humiliation lingered in memory, whispered behind backs passed from neighbor to neighbor long after the pain subsided. A man might survive the punishment, but he would carry the scar of ridicule for life. Humiliation as justice was not unique to Greece. In medieval Europe, adulterers might be paraded through the streets wearing signs of their offense. In China, criminals were sometimes forced into Kangoo's heavy wooden collars that turned them into walking spectacles of disgrace. In all times, societies have known that shame can cut deeper than the lash. Raphanadosis, then, is more than a bizarre footnote in the annals of punishment. It is a window into the psychology of Greek justice, where reputation was as fragile as glass, and the most terrifying penalty was not death, but dishonor. To laugh at the condemned was to kill them socially, to exile them from the respect that made life bearable. And in the theatre of Athens, where words could be weapons and ridicule could topple reputations, punishment by humiliation was as potent as any sword. Not every punishment in ancient Greece was designed to shock, humiliate, or terrify the public. Some carried a strange calm, wrapped in ritual and legality, yet concealed a slow and merciless cruelty. None is more famous or more haunting than the Athenian method of execution by hemlock, a punishment remembered not for its spectacle, but for the quiet death of philosophy's greatest mind, Socrates. In Athens, execution was not a chaotic act of vengeance, but a civic procedure. When a citizen was condemned to die, the most common method was to drink a cup of poison brewed from Conium maculatum, the spotted hemlock plant. The draught was not quick and certainly not painless. Hemlock is a neurotoxin. It does not burn or bleed. Instead, it paralyzes. The poison begins in the feet, creeping slowly upward through the body, freezing muscles one by one. All the while, the mind remains aware, trapped inside a failing vessel. Death comes only when the diaphragm ceases to move, and breath can no longer be drawn. Suffocation arrives not as a blow, but as a suffocating silence. In 399 BCE, Athens sentenced Socrates to this fate. The charges were impiety, failing to honor the city's gods, and corrupting the youth with dangerous ideas. To some, he was a gadfly, buzzing endlessly with questions that unsettled the city. To others, he was a threat to the fragile democracy recovering from war and political upheaval. Whatever the true motive, the punishment was clear: a lawful death in the name of civic order. Plato's Phaedo preserves the most vivid account of that day. We see Socrates surrounded by friends, calmly discussing the immortality of the soul, even as the cup is brought in. No cries, no panic. He drinks the poison without resistance. His companions weep, but he rebukes them gently, reminding them that death is not an evil, but a passage. His last words are strikingly mundane. Crito. We owe a cock to Asclepius. See to it and don't forget. To some, this was gratitude for release from the disease of life itself, a final philosophical jest in the face of death. Yet, beneath the composure, the cruelty of the method remains. Imagine the creeping paralysis, the moment when toes refuse to move, when the chest tightens, when each breath grows shallower. The poison transforms the body into a prison, extinguishing movement before extinguishing thought. It was in its way a punishment tailored for philosophers. The body silenced first the mind, last forcing reflection until the very end. What made hemlock distinctive among punishments was its civic framing. Unlike the Brazen Bull, it was not designed for spectacle. Unlike raphanadosis, it was not crafted to disgrace. It was instead a ritual of law, a sentence carried out with apparent dignity. But that civility was itself deceptive. For what could be more chilling than a democracy calmly killing its wisest citizen, not with rage or bloodlust, but with paperwork and a cup? The Athenians believed they were acting with order and restraint. In truth, they engineered a punishment whose quiet horror lay precisely in its normality. The execution of Socrates became a moral wound that Athens never healed. Later philosophers from Plato to Cicero grappled with its meaning. Was it justice? Was it fear disguised as law? Or was it the ultimate proof that even the most enlightened societies can rationalize cruelty when threatened? The method itself was not unique to Socrates. Hemlock was the standard penalty for capital crimes among citizens. But without him, we might not remember it at all. His calm acceptance turned a civic procedure into a philosophical parable. And yet, for all the noble framing, the reality remains. It was a slow, suffocating death, chosen precisely because it allowed Athens to cloak violence in civility. Here lies the paradox of Athenian justice. The same city that birthed democracy drama and philosophy also codified death by poison. They saw no contradiction in elevating human reason on the stage while extinguishing it in the courtroom. To them, the ritual was not cruelty, but order. To us, it is a reminder of how power can disguise violence beneath the language of law. In the end, the image endures. Socrates, cup in hand, his voice steady, his friends in tears, his body slowly failing while his mind soared into final speculation. The poison was meant to silence him. Instead, it immortalized him. Hemlock gave Athens its illusion of control, but it gave the world a martyr of philosophy. Not all punishments in ancient Greece ended in death. Some were designed to leave the condemned alive, but marked forever, living reminders of their crime stripped of dignity and power. Among the most feared of these was blinding. To lose one's sight in a world where civic participation, military service, and public honor depended on visibility was not only a physical mutilation, it was a civic annihilation. Blinding was used sparingly, but when imposed, it carried devastating symbolism. In Athens and other polis, to see was to belong. The assembly, the theatre, the battlefield, all required sight. To remove a person's eyes was to cast them out of civic life without physically exiling them. They remained within the community, but were rendered invisible as citizens. It was the ultimate mark of exclusion. You may still breathe, but you no longer count. The methods were brutal. Hot irons pressed against the sockets until the eyes were seared. Sharp implements gouged out vision in an instant, leaving scars that proclaimed guilt to all who looked. In some cases, partial blinding was inflicted not enough to kill, but enough to disfigure, ensuring that shame clung to the offender's face like a permanent mask. Such mutilations were not random acts of vengeance. They were deliberate political tools, often deployed against those accused of treason, betrayal, or sacrilege. One story, though embellished by later writers, tells of Greek tyrants blinding rivals to ensure they could never again lead armies or inspire followers. In a society where leadership required physical presence, to be blinded was to be neutralized without the mess of execution. It was a form of silencing that erased both political power and personal identity. Religious crimes were also subject to such punishments. Defiling a sacred space or betraying oaths sworn before the gods could result in mutilation. The logic was grimly poetic. If you had turned your eyes against divine order, then your eyes were no longer fit to see. Punishment became ritual purification, a way of restoring cosmic balance by physically altering the offender. The social consequences were as severe as the physical ones. A blinded man might survive, but he would live as an outcast. In a culture obsessed with arete excellence and the display of honor, his disfigurement branded him as defective, a living warning to others. Unlike exile, which removed the offender blinding, forced him to exist within society as a spectacle of disgrace. The punishment was not only for him, but for everyone who saw him stumble in the streets. There are parallels in Greek literature. The tragedy of Oedipus, though myth rather than law, reflects how blindness carried both punishment and symbolism. Oedipus blinds himself when he discovers the truth of his crimes, turning his eyes inward because they had failed to perceive the truth. His act was voluntary, but it resonated with cultural meaning. Blindness equaled moral downfall. In historical practice, when the state imposed it, blindness conveyed the same lesson. Your body now reflects your guilt. Other forms of mutilation were inflicted as well, cutting off hands, tongues, or ears, each chosen to target the essence of the crime. A betrayer might lose the hand that signed a false oath. A slanderer could be threatened with tongue removal. These punishments were less common than fines, exile, or execution, but when employed, they carried immense psychological weight. The message was clear. The community had the power not only to end your life, but to reshape it into a permanent emblem of dishonor. From a modern perspective, such penalties blur the line between law and cruelty. But in ancient Greece, they reinforced the order of the polis. The body was treated as an extension of civic identity, and altering it became a way to rewrite the person's place in society. To blind, to disfigure, to mutilate. These were not merely punishments, but political acts reasserting the community's control over the individual. The cruelty lay not only in the pain of the act, but in the years that followed. A man without eyes could no longer serve in war, read poetry, or watch the rituals that bound the city together. He lived but as a diminished shadow, condemned to hear what others saw, and to feel the weight of stares he could never return. His body testified to the city's power long after the sentence was passed. Blinding and mutilation then reveal the darker edge of Greek justice. They show us that punishment was not always about swift death, but about permanent erasure of status, dignity, and participation. In a world where sight was synonymous with life, to be blinded was to be condemned to a living death. Among the earliest and most primal forms of execution in the Greek world was death by stones. Stoning, or lithobolia, carried a power that no blade or poison could match. It was not just a killing, it was a collective act, a community rising as one to erase an offender. In Athens and other city-states, this method was reserved for crimes that polluted the polis itself. Sacrilege, treason, or act so vile that one person's guilt was considered everyone's contamination. The roots of this practice stretched deep into the ancient Mediterranean. In Near Eastern traditions, stoning was already established as a way to punish blasphemy and adultery. Greece inherited and reshaped it, binding it to the needs of the polis. To throw stones was to purify, to cleanse, to reaffirm the solidarity of citizens against a single figure who had broken the sacred order. A sword strike might have been quicker, a cup of hemlock more controlled, but stones gave the city its say. The condemned would be dragged from the court or the assembly to a public ground, sometimes outside the city walls. There the people gathered armed, not with spears or shields, but with the most ordinary weapons imaginable: rocks. Each citizen's hand became the executioner. Each stone carried not only physical weight, but moral judgment. To kill with stones was to declare in the most visible and participatory way possible that the offender was no longer one of them. It was a punishment of endurance. Rarely did the first blows kill outright. Instead, they broke bones, split flesh, and ground the body down until life was gone. The process was slow, agonizing, and communal. The condemned saw not the face of a single executioner, but the collective will of the city raining down upon them. In this way, stoning blurred the line between law and mob, between justice and vengeance. Draco's infamous Athenian laws of the 7th century BCE, the ones Aristotle said prescribed death for almost every offense, likely codified stoning as one of many brutal options. while later Athens preferred more structured executions like hemlock, the memory of stoning lingered. It was a punishment of extremes used when the community itself felt violated, when purification demanded not just the death of the offender, but their public annihilation. There was also ritual in the act. To be stoned was not merely to be killed, it was to be expelled from the symbolic body of the city. Sometimes the corpse of the stoned was denied burial. Within civic grounds, an added layer of disgrace. To be denied burial in Greek culture was almost worse than death itself. Without rites, the soul was believed to wander restless, unanchored, cut off from both the living and the gods. Thus, the punishment extended beyond the body to the eternal. Archaeological traces are sparse, but literary references confirm the practice. In tragedy and comedy alike, playwrights invoked the image of stoning as the ultimate threat. Audiences knew its meaning instantly. Not only would the condemned die, but they would be erased from the social fabric. Even when not enacted, the idea of stoning hung over Greek life as a reminder that the community held the final authority. The symbolism of stones was powerful. A stone is common found in every street and field belonging to no one. When lifted by the hand of a citizen, it became the weapon of all. Unlike a sword which bore the mark of a soldier or a magistrate, the stone erased individuality. The punishment was not about the killer, but about the act. The city itself killed. From a modern view, stoning seems barbaric, a mob's cruelty, rather than justice. Yet, for the Greeks, it embodied democracy in its most brutal form. It was the people themselves enacting judgment, their collective violence framed as the will of the polis. In its cruelty, it revealed a paradox. A society that celebrated law order and rational debate still allowed its citizens to hurl stones until a body lay broken, because some acts demanded not law alone, but shared vengeance. And so, when we think of Greek justice, we must not picture only the calm philosopher's trial, the cup of hemlock passed with solemn dignity. We must also picture the circle of citizens, the rising arc of stones, the slow erasure of one life at the hands of many. The stones of justice tell us that Greek law was not always lofty or restrained. Sometimes it was raw, primitive, and communal, a reminder that beneath the marble ideals of democracy lay the jagged edges of fear and fury. In Athens, justice did not always roar with the sound of stones. Sometimes it whispered in silence, in darkness, in the slow and merciless erosion of life. That silence had a name, the Barathron, carved into the rocky cliffs just outside the city. This chasm served as one of Athens' most feared places of execution. To be condemned to the Barathron was not simply to die, it was to be cast out of the community body and soul, to vanish, in a void where no prayers were said and no rites were granted. The Barathron was more than a hole in the ground. It was a civic symbol, a place where Athens sent those considered unworthy of belonging. Murderers, traitors, and especially those accused of betraying military secrets might be hurled into its depths. Some were thrown in alive, their bodies breaking on jagged rock, left to starve in darkness. Others were cast there posthumously, their corpses denied burial as a mark of ultimate disgrace. In both cases, the result was the same obliteration. The punishment was not designed for speed. A sword stroke ended life in an instant, and hemlock, for all its cruelty, at least offered a ritual calm. The pit was different. It was abandonment days, without food or water, the slow onset of thirst, the gnaw of hunger, the mind unraveling in the silence. In a society that prized community song and shared rituals, this was the antithesis of Greek life. To be left alone in the Barathron was to be denied humanity itself. Literary references hint at its grim reality. Scholia. Ancient commentaries on orators like Demosthenes mention the Barathron as the execution ground of traitors. Aristophanes, the comic playwright, mocked it in his satire, knowing that his audience understood the horror of the name. To invoke the Barathron on stage was to conjure a shiver of recognition. Everyone knew what it meant, even if few would ever see it with their own eyes. The choice of location was deliberate. Just as stoning was public, the pit was hidden. Its isolation mirrored the civic intention. Stoning made guilt a spectacle, reaffirming unity through violence. The Barathron, by contrast, symbolized exclusion. The condemned was not worthy of even being seen. Their death was not a performance, but an erasure, a quiet excision from the body of the polis. The people did not need to throw stones. The rocks of the pit did the work for them. This method also reflected Athens's deep concern with pollution miasma. Certain crimes were thought to stain not just the individual, but the entire city. A murderer unpunished invited the wrath of the gods. A traitor left alive endangered the safety of the community. Throwing them into the Barathron was both punishment and purification. Out of sight, out of the city, out of memory. There are hints, too, that the pit was used for political ends. In times of tension, accusations of treason could serve as convenient tools to eliminate rivals. To condemn someone to the Barathron was not just to remove them physically, but to obliterate their name. With no grave, no ritual, and no inscription, memory itself was destroyed. In a culture where kleos, glory, remembrance, was everything, this was the harshest fate imaginable. From a modern perspective, the pit might appear less dramatic than the Brazen Bull or the spectacle of stoning. But its cruelty lay in its quietness. There were no screams to echo through the marketplace, no public lesson to be drawn in blood. Instead, there was silence. And within that silence, the condemned were stripped of even the dignity of protest. Their suffering became invisible, and that invisibility was itself the punishment. Archaeologists believe they have located the site of the Barathron in the rocky escarpments near Athens. Broken pottery fragments, animal bones, and signs of disposal suggest it was indeed a place of casting away of things and of people. It was not monumental. It was not beautiful. It was a wound in the earth, practical and final. The Barathron reminds us that justice in Athens had many faces, public, theatrical, participatory, but also secretive, silent, and annihilating. Where stoning involved everyone, the pit involved no one. It asked nothing of the citizens except to forget. And perhaps that was the point. The condemned were not meant to be remembered. They were meant to vanish, swallowed by stone, erased from the story. Yet here, centuries later, we still speak their names. Not all, for most, are lost, but enough to know the truth. The Barathron did not succeed in total silence. Its existence is itself a voice, faint but insistent, telling us that even the most celebrated democracies had places where law became cruelty, where justice was abandonment, and where memory was deliberately buried in the dark. In ancient Greece, punishment was never only about the condemned. It was also about those who watched, those who decided, those who wielded power through fear. To study Greek punishments is to study politics, because every execution, every humiliation, every pit of silence was also a performance of authority. Consider the tyrant Phalaris of Akragas, whose name is forever tied to the Brazen Bull. His cruelty was not just personal sadism, but political theatre. By turning executions into roaring spectacles, he reminded subjects that resistance would not simply be crushed, it would be turned into a story, a warning, a legend. In this way, punishments became tools of governance, where terror filled the gaps that laws could not. Even when his own fate reversed when he was allegedly roasted in his own device, the message remained. Power in Greece was inseparable from the performance of cruelty. Yet Greece was not only ruled by tyrants. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, prided itself on law procedure and civic equality, and still the same city that boasted jury courts and citizen assemblies also forced Socrates, its greatest philosopher, to drink hemlock. His crime? Corrupting the youth and impiety charges that revealed less about his deeds and more about the insecurities of the polis. His death was not chaotic mob violence, nor a tyrant's whim, but the outcome of a vote carried out with chilling formality. Athens cloaked its cruelty in legality, presenting punishment, not as passion, but as process. This duality, tyrannical spectacle and democratic procedure, shows us how punishments reinforced political systems. In tyrannies, cruelty served as deterrence and demonstration of dominance. In democracies, punishment was sanitized, framed as the collective will, but it still functioned to silence dissent and preserve civic order. Both forms, in their own ways, ensured stability by teaching citizens what could not be questioned. Punishments also reflected the struggles between factions. In turbulent times, accusations of impiety or treason became political weapons. Rivals could be eliminated, not on the battlefield, but in the courts or execution grounds. The threat of the barathron, the shame of rapanadosis, or the solemn cup of hemlock, all could be turned from instruments of justice into instruments of political revenge. The line between law and power was thin, and punishments crossed it often. Even collective acts like stoning carried political weight. To stone someone was to enact the will of the polis, but who the polis chose to stone revealed whose voices dominated at that moment. Public punishments were not neutral. They were shaped by who held influence, who could frame an act as betrayal, who could brand a rival as a threat to civic purity. Behind every execution lay not just crime, but politics. Religion too blurred with politics in punishment. Crimes of sacrilege or impiety were punished harshly, not only to appease the gods, but also to assert political legitimacy. Leaders could show themselves as guardians of cosmic order by enforcing religious law. To punish a blasphemer was to display loyalty to the divine, and by extension to claim divine backing for one's rule. In this way, the lash, the pit, or the cup became as much about maintaining power as maintaining piety. What makes Greek punishments striking is how intentional they were. They were not chaotic outbreaks of cruelty, but carefully chosen acts with symbolic resonance. To blind a traitor was not only to disable him, but to strip him of civic vision, ensuring he could never lead again. To stone a blasphemer was not only to kill, but to make the community complicit, binding citizens together in shared violence. To throw a man into the barathron was not only to end his life, but to erase him from the city's memory. Each punishment spoke a political language designed to reinforce the system that delivered it. From a modern view, we might want to separate politics from justice, imagining courts as neutral and punishments as blind. The Greeks remind us that such separation is an illusion. Justice in their world was always a mirror of power shaped by fear, ambition, and the need to control memory. When tyrants ruled, cruelty was spectacular. When citizens ruled, cruelty was codified. In both, punishment was a stage, and the condemned were actors in a play written by power itself. The lesson is sobering. Athens gave us democracy and philosophy, yet it also gave us the Barathron and the Hemlock Cup. Phalaris gave us tyranny, but he also showed the lengths rulers would go to secure obedience. The instruments may differ, but the purpose was the same: to ensure that power, whether one man or collective, remained unchallenged. Punishment in Greece was never only about justice, it was about politics, and in politics, cruelty was often the clearest language of all. In the Greek world, the body was not just flesh, it was reputation, identity, the vessel of honor itself. To strike the body was to strike the soul of a citizen, and to humiliate the body was to erase one's place in the polis. For this reason, many punishments in Greece were designed not simply to inflict pain, but to carve shame into the skin, to turn a human being into a living warning. Athenians believed that honor time was the foundation of civic life. A man standing in the assembly, his right to speak, his ability to serve in war, all depended on his honor. Women's honor was more fragile still, tied to chastity, reputation, and silence. To lose honor was worse than death. It meant being cast out from the moral fabric of the community. Punishments were therefore calibrated not only to punish the crime, but to broadcast dishonor. Take rhapanidosis, that strange, almost absurd punishment mentioned in Aristophanes' comedies. The act of inserting a radish into an offender's body was not simply painful, it was degrading. It branded the offender with ridicule, stripping him of dignity in the eyes of all who saw or heard. In a society where reputation was everything to be remembered, as the man subjected to such a punishment was a social death, a stain carried longer than bruises. Blinding, too, carried symbolic weight. By burning or gouging out a traitor's eyes, the city made a statement. This man will never again see the polis, never again watch over its walls, never again stand as witness in its courts. His body became a testimony of betrayal, a walking reminder of what awaited those who turned against their people. Such punishments combined physical ruin with civic exile. The same can be said of stoning. In stoning, the body was broken collectively, each stone a fragment of society's judgment. But the deeper wound was symbolic. To be stoned was to be deemed unworthy of belonging. Citizens hurled stones, not only to kill, but to erase, to cast the condemned out of the moral body of the city. The corpse, often denied burial afterward, was not only a body destroyed, but an identity obliterated. Even less spectacular punishments carried this logic of shame. Public whippings in the agora branding criminals with visible scars, shaving the head of offenders. These were all ways to mark dishonor in the body. The punishment did not end with the act. The scar, the memory, the whispers followed for life. Pain faded, but shame remained. In Athens, where orators competed in the assembly and athletes competed in the games, the body was also a stage for honor. To humiliate that body was to dismantle a man's standing. A hoplite who lost his shield in battle could face disgrace worse than death, for the shield symbolized communal protection. Some punishments mimicked this logic, stripping offenders of their armor, parading them half-naked through the city, or forbidding them from speaking in the assembly. To be silenced publicly was itself a punishment, a mark of dishonor as lasting as scars. For women, dishonor was tied to sexuality and reputation. Punishments targeting women often aimed at public shame rather than pain. Rumors, accusations of adultery, and symbolic acts of humiliation could destroy a woman's life. Even without physical torment, her body imagined or spoken about became a battlefield of honor. Silence and seclusion were demanded as forms of protection, but when that shield cracked, punishment was often merciless. This obsession with honor explains why many Greeks chose suicide over certain punishments. To be mutilated, to be humiliated, to be stoned, or paraded was to live dishonored. Death, in contrast, allowed some measure of control. Philosophers like Plato and later Stoics framed death as preferable to shame, arguing that the soul could preserve dignity even if the body could not. Thus, punishments that targeted honor were especially cruel, for they offered no escape. The victim lived on, stripped of dignity, forced to carry shame as a second skin. The political dimension of honor is also clear. Leaders could use punishment to stain rivals' names permanently. A charge of impiety, a spectacle of whipping, or a denial of burial could ruin not only a person, but his descendants. Dishonor spread across generations, marking families as tainted. In this way, punishment did not end with one body, but rippled through social memory. The Greeks who gave us philosophy, democracy, and drama also perfected the art of punishing through shame. To them, dishonor was more enduring than wounds, more feared than pain. They understood that a scar could fade, but a name ruined in the agora or the theater could never be repaired. Punishment of the body was not an end in itself. It was a script, a performance meant to tell society who belonged, who betrayed, and who would be remembered only with whispers. In the end, the Greek obsession with honor reveals a paradox. They built their culture on reputation and civic pride, yet used punishment to strip those very things away. To kill a body was ordinary. To kill a name, that was true power. And in the cruel mathematics of the polis, sometimes the destruction of honor was considered the most effective form of justice. In ancient Greece, justice was never entirely secular. The line between law and religion blurred until punishment itself often carried the weight of ritual. To offend the gods was not merely a private failing, it was a civic crime. And to punish such offenses, Greeks believed was to restore balance to the cosmos. Violence was not only political, it was sacred. Consider the crime of sacrilege, stealing from temples, mocking rituals, or defiling sacred spaces. The penalty was severe, sometimes death by stoning or being hurled into the Barathron, the rocky pit outside Athens reserved for enemies of the polis. The act of execution in such cases was not just civic discipline, it was purification. By removing the offender, the community believed it cleansed itself of divine anger. In this way, punishment became a kind of offering to the gods, a blood sacrifice in exchange for the city's safety. The trial and death of Socrates reveals this logic. Officially, he was condemned for impiety and corrupting the youth crimes framed as offences, not merely against fellow citizens, but against the gods themselves. His execution by hemlock was carried out as though it were a sacred duty. Athens did not see it as killing a philosopher, but as appeasing the divine order. The quiet ritual of his death cup in hand was as much a sacrifice as an execution. Other punishments were explicitly theatrical in their religious framing. Public executions often took place near altars or in festival settings. Blood mixed with ritual symbolism, reminding spectators that punishment was not only civic deterrence, but also sacred purification. To kill an adulterer, a traitor, or a blasphemer was to make an offering of their body, restoring harmony between mortals and gods. This intertwining of cruelty and sanctity is visible in the Brazen Bull allegedly invented for the tyrant Phalaris in Acragas. Though the device was grotesque, roasting victims alive while their screams echoed like a bull's bellow, it was defended in ancient accounts as a form of sacrifice. The roaring bull evoked Zeus, the thunderer, while the victim's suffering became both entertainment and ritual spectacle. Even cruelty could be cloaked in divine imagery. Religious festivals, too, carried undertones of punishment. At certain Dionysian rituals, scapegoats called pharmakoi were beaten, paraded or expelled from the city to cleanse the community of pollution. Some scholars believe these scapegoats were executed, their deaths serving as ritual purgation. Whether symbolic or real, the logic was the same: to spill blood or to humiliate in order to preserve the favor of the gods. The Greeks' sense of cosmic balance meant that divine offenses demanded responses harsher than ordinary crimes. Blinding mutilation or denial of burial were common for those who betrayed sacred trust. Denying burial was especially significant. To the Greeks, a soul without a grave wandered restlessly, unable to cross into Hades. To leave a body unburied was not just civic punishment, it was eternal punishment, a curse upon the soul. In tragedies like Sophocles' Antigone, the horror of denying burial becomes a central conflict. To withhold funeral rites was to condemn a person to unending dishonor before both men and gods. Even collective punishments could be framed as sacred duty. Stoning used against those accused of blasphemy was not simply civic violence. By requiring the whole community to participate, it transformed execution into ritual purification. Each stone thrown was both an act of justice and a symbolic offering, ensuring that no single person bore the burden of blood. The community as a whole became cleansed, united in righteous violence. This religious dimension also explains why punishments often targeted not just the body, but reputation. Offenses against the gods threatened not only the individual, but the city itself. To destroy the offender's honor was to mark publicly that the community had purged its pollution. Shame became a tool of purification as potent as the sword. The paradox is chilling. A society that produced temples of dazzling beauty and philosophies of cosmic order also normalized sacred cruelty. Justice and worship could overlap in ways that sanctified pain. To punish a man was not only to uphold civic order, but to reassure the gods that the community remained obedient. In this sense, ancient Greek punishments cannot be understood merely as brutality. They were part of a larger worldview where the gods watched constantly, where civic failure could bring famine plague or defeat in war. Every execution, every mutilation, every denial of burial was performed not only for men, but for Olympus itself. And yet this fusion of sacred and violent justice raises haunting questions. When cruelty is cloaked in ritual, who dares to challenge it? When blood is shed at an altar? Who dares to say it was not necessary? The Greeks believed they were preserving cosmic balance, but to the victims, the blinded, the stoned, the cast into the pit. It must have felt less like purification and more like a divine betrayal where even the gods seemed to sanction their suffering. In the Athenian imagination, justice began in the courts. Athens prided itself on being a city where law was not dictated by tyrants, but decided by citizens. Juries composed of hundreds, even thousands of ordinary men were summoned to decide the fate of their peers. Trials where public speeches were recorded, and the people believed they had built a system of reason over raw violence. Yet, beneath the orderly facade, cruelty lurked close. The courtroom could deliver not just verdicts, but spectacles of suffering. Consider how trials worked. A citizen accused of a serious crime faced a jury chosen by lot, a mass of men drawn from the city. Lawyers as we know them did not exist. The accused spoke for themselves or hired speechwriters to craft persuasive orations. Reputation rhetoric and the mood of the crowd carried as much weight as evidence. In theory, it was democratic justice. In practice, it could be mob rule with a legal mask. And once a verdict was given, punishments could swing between fines and exile or veer into mutilation, public execution, and erasure. The trial of Socrates in 399 BCE remains the most famous example. His accusers charged him with impiety and corrupting the youth, vague yet powerful accusations in a city still scarred by war and political upheaval. The jury of 500 citizens voted for his death, and Athens carried out the penalty with calm ritual, a cup of hemlock drunk under law. On the surface, it was a humane execution, but beneath it was the chilling reality that philosophy itself had been condemned, that the voice of reason could be silenced with the authority of the people. Athens showed the world that democracy could cloak cruelty in legal process. Other cases reveal how quickly trials slid into torment. Under Draco Athens' earliest lawgiver punishments were notoriously harsh death, prescribed for even minor offences. Aristotle later quipped that Draco wrote his laws not in ink, but in blood. Later reforms under Solon moderated some penalties. Yet the principle remained: the state had the power to strip honour, property, and life with a single vote. Even when penalties were not death, they could be ruinous. Exile meant the loss of homeland and community, a living death in a culture where belonging defined identity. Political trials in particular blurred the line between justice and vengeance. Leaders who fell out of favour were charged with treason, impiety, or sacrilege, and their punishment became a warning to others. Sometimes the outcome was confiscation of property, ensuring that the condemned's family suffered as well. At other times, the accused was mutilated, blinded, or hurled into the Barathron. In such moments, Athens showed that trials were not always about truth, but about power. The jury became an executioner, and the courtroom a theatre of cruelty. Nor was Athens alone. Across the Greek world, trials often ended in punishments designed for spectacle. In some cities, those convicted of betrayal were paraded before execution, humiliated before being put to death. In others, exile was accompanied by the public destruction of the condemned's home, erasing their presence from the community. These acts remind us that justice in the ancient polis was as much about performance as procedure. The rituals of punishment extended even to the condemned themselves. Before death, some were forced to wear symbolic garb, branded as traitors or criminals in their final moments. Others were denied funeral rites, ensuring their memory would be tarnished. To the community, these rituals declared victory over impurity. To the victim, they stripped away the last fragments of dignity. It is striking how often law and cruelty walked hand in hand. When we think of torture, we imagine secret dungeons or tyrants' whims. But in Greece, torture could emerge from the open processes of democracy itself. Citizens acting as jurors voted for deaths that were meant not only to punish, but to terrify. The slow poisoning of Socrates, the starving of traitors in the pit, the stoning of blasphemers, all were cloaked in legality. The people believed they were preserving order, yet, in truth, they had transformed the courtroom into a stage, where cruelty could play with the mask of justice. In this contradiction lies a haunting lesson. The Greeks gave the world trial by jury speeches that shaped the history of law and ideals of civic equality. Yet they also normalized punishments that inflicted humiliation, mutilation, and death. To sit in judgment was not only to decide guilt, but to decide how much pain a body should endure, how much shame a name should carry. Law was not a shield against cruelty. At times, it was its most effective weapon. When we think of ancient Greece, our minds often go to the extremes. Socrates calmly drinking poison, traitors hurled into the Barathron, or the Brazen Bull blazing under Sicilian skies. Yet, the machinery of justice did not always operate in such spectacular form. For most Athenians, punishment was far more ordinary. Whippings, fines, exile, confiscations. These measures, though less theatrical than engineered death, still shaped the rhythm of civic life and carried their own cruelty. Whipping was among the most common forms of discipline, particularly for slaves and lower classes. The crack of the lash could be heard in markets, workshops, and farms. Enslaved people might be flogged for disobedience, debtors whipped for failing to pay, and petty criminals scourged in public squares. The purpose was not only pain, but humiliation, punishment performed before neighbors, turning suffering into a reminder of order. While whipping left no monuments like the Colosseum, it carved its memory on backs and shoulders, a silent ledger of wounds. Fines were another favored penalty, especially in Athens, where the law courts thrived on monetary punishment. A citizen might be fined for impiety, for failing to fulfill civic duties, or for slander. For the wealthy, fines could be a manageable nuisance. For the poor, they were ruinous, sometimes leading to imprisonment or enslavement if unpaid. The system reinforced class divides. The rich could absorb penalties with silver, the poor paid in flesh. What appears as rational civic order was often an economic filter, determining who could remain in good standing and who would be cast out. Exile, too, was a deeply feared sentence. To be exiled meant more than relocation. In the Greek mind, identity was bound to the polis, your city, your soil, your gods. To lose it was to lose the anchor of existence. Ostracism. That peculiar Athenian invention formalized this fear. Citizens could vote to expel a man for 10 years by scratching his name on a shard of pottery, the ostrakon. No trial was required, no crime necessary, only the suspicion that someone had grown too powerful. The result was both bloodless and devastating. Exile stripped a man of his community and condemned him to wander alive but politically dead. Confiscation of property often accompanied exile or execution. A condemned man's house could be demolished, his land seized, his name erased from civic records. This practice ensured that punishment extended to family, echoing beyond the individual. The destruction of a home was a symbolic act erasing not only a person, but the physical trace of their presence. Archaeology sometimes finds the scars of these erasures plots of land where foundations abruptly stop their owners blotted from memory by decree. Even minor infractions carried penalties that could scar reputations. Public shaming was a favored tool. Offenders might be forced to stand in marketplaces marked by placards describing their crimes. In a society obsessed with honor, such shame could wound more deeply than lashes. Philosophers like Aristotle recognized this punishment did not always need to mutilate the body, when it could instead tarnish the name, a form of social death that endured long after pain faded. Yet, these everyday punishments also reveal a paradox. While they lacked the brutality of the Brazen Bull or the horror of stoning, they could be more effective in maintaining order. Fines filled the city's coffers, exile removed dangerous rivals without bloodshed, and whippings reminded the powerless of their place. Cruelty scaled with the crime, but even the smallest sentence carried weight. A single shard with your name could decide your fate. A single lash could remind you of your chains. It is tempting to see these punishments as civilized, especially compared to the excesses of tyrants. Yet, they carried their own quiet violence. The whip made cruelty routine. The fine made justice. A transaction exile made belonging fragile. Altogether, they created a system where fear was woven into daily life, not through spectacle alone, but through the ordinary penalties that touched citizens and slaves alike. And perhaps that was the truest genius of Greek justice. The police did not need to burn men alive every week to remind people of its power. It could whip fine exile and confiscate spreading discipline in ways so familiar they became invisible. The extraordinary punishments shocked, the ordinary ones shaped the soul of the city, and both in their own way made cruelty a constant companion of civic life. In the polished marble courts of Athens, citizens prided themselves on due process. Trials were decided by juries of hundreds, sometimes thousands of men drawn from the citizen body. Laws were debated, penalties codified, and verdicts delivered in orderly fashion. To many later admirers, this was the birthplace of rational justice. Yet, beneath the surface, the line between law and vengeance blurred. Punishments were not always about impartial justice. They were often about power rivalry and the need to display control. Take the tyrants of Sicily and the Aegean. Phalaris of Acragas, infamous for the Brazen Bull, did not use his contraption because law required it. He used it to terrify subjects and silence dissent. The bull was dressed up in the language of order, presented as a lawful execution, but its true function was vengeance cloaked as justice. Tyrants understood that cruelty needed the veneer of legality. A death sentence inscribed in official records looked less like revenge and more like civic duty, even when the motive was personal fear or anger. Even in democratic Athens, where the ideal of equality before the law was loudly proclaimed, passion and politics often drove the outcome. The trial of Socrates remains the most famous example. Officially, he was condemned for impiety and corrupting the youth. But beneath the charges lay a storm of resentments, his associations with controversial figures, his tendency to question authority, his refusal to flatter the demos. The jury's decision was not detached legality. It was the city's collective revenge against a man who had become inconvenient. Athens killed him by the letter of the law, but the spirit it was vengeance. The same can be seen in ostracism. No crime was required, no evidence presented. Citizens scratched names into pottery shards, exiling men whose popularity or influence threatened the balance of power. Sometimes it removed genuine dangers. Sometimes it silenced rivals. Was this law? Or was it a socially sanctioned act of political revenge? To the exiled, the distinction hardly mattered. Their lives were uprooted by the whims of neighbors wielding the fragile weapon of fear. Mob violence further blurred the line. When passions ran high, the crowd could become judge, jury, and executioner. Enemies of democracy were sometimes dragged through the streets, beaten or lynched without trial. Philosophers and playwrights warned against this volatility, yet it remained part of civic life. Even when courts later ratified the punishment, the spark had been vengeance, not sober justice. In such cases, the legal system did not restrain cruelty, it followed it. This duality law on one hand, vengeance on the other, was not hidden from ancient observers. Thucydides, describing the chaos of civil war in Corcyra, noted that words themselves were twisted, reckless daring was called courage. Moderation was seen as cowardice, and vengeance was disguised as justice. In times of strife, the distinction collapsed entirely. Greek polis prided themselves on the rule of law. Yet, in moments of fear or anger, the law became a mask for the raw desire to destroy enemies. One striking example lies in cases of treason or sacrilege. Betrayers of the polis might be blinded, hurled into the Barathron, or denied burial. The law framed these as necessary defenses of the city's integrity. Yet, the fury with which punishments were carried out, families' ruined names, erased houses, demolished betrays another motive: vengeance against those who dared to defy communal identity. The polis was not merely correcting, it was retaliating, purging the offender as one would a personal enemy. Even philosophers struggled with this tension. Plato, in his dialogues, envisioned laws that sought to rehabilitate, rather than simply destroy. Yet, he lived in a city that had executed his teacher out of resentment. Aristotle spoke of the balance between justice and revenge, but still accepted slavery and corporal punishment as part of order. Their silence or contradictions reflect the difficulty of reconciling lofty ideals with the realities of a society where the wound of insult or betrayal often demanded a bloody answer. What makes this line so haunting is how deliberately it was obscured. Citizens told themselves they were acting through the law, upholding order. Yet, the theatre of punishment, the public square, the spectacle of the lash, the ritual of exile, betrays an emotional satisfaction, a hunger to see enemies humiliated and erased. Law gave vengeance a stage and a script, transforming anger into civic performance. And so, the legacy of Greek justice is not a simple one of rationality and fairness. It is the story of a society that dressed revenge in the robes of law and cruelty in the language of civic virtue. The line between the two was thin, sometimes invisible, and often deliberately crossed. The question remains, when a community punishes, Is it upholding justice, or simply giving form to its anger? In ancient Greece, the answer was often both, and the victims were left to pay the price. Ancient Greece is remembered as the cradle of philosophy, a place where reason, virtue, and the pursuit of truth were elevated above brute instinct. Yet, even as Plato, Aristotle, and others wrote of justice, harmony, and the good life, their societies practiced punishments that were brutal, humiliating, and often lethal. The philosophers stood at the intersection of ideals and reality. The question is, did they challenge cruelty, or did they rationalize it? Plato offers perhaps the most fascinating paradox. In his Republic, he imagined a society ruled by philosopher kings, guided by reason and dedicated to the common good. Justice, he argued, was harmony, the balance of parts within the soul, mirrored in the balance of citizens within the polis. Yet, when it came to punishment, Plato was not squeamish about severity. In the laws, he recommended whipping, exile, and even death, for certain crimes, framing them not as vengeance, but as corrective medicine for the soul. He compared the legislator to a doctor prescribing bitter cures for disease. The rhetoric of healing disguised what in practice remained brutal coercion. Socrates' own execution by hemlock, calm legal, yet inescapably cruel, shows how a society steeped in philosophy could still sanction death for dissent. Aristotle, student of Plato and tutor to Alexander the Great, was no less conflicted. He described humans as political animals, meant to live in communities governed by justice. He praised moderation, balance, and rational self-control. Yet, he also defended the institution of slavery, calling some people natural slaves destined to serve those of greater intellect. This reasoning offered philosophical cover to a system that inflicted daily suffering on thousands. For Aristotle, cruelty could be justified if it maintained order or expressed a supposed natural hierarchy. His words reveal the limits of philosophy when confronted with entrenched power and convenience. Other thinkers were no more consistent. The Stoics, who taught self-mastery and the brotherhood of humankind, occasionally hinted at compassion for slaves. Seneca, centuries later in Rome, would remind masters that their slaves were fellow humans deserving of kindness. Yet, even he admitted that harsh punishments were part of maintaining authority. Compassion was a suggestion, not a law. In the Greek world, few philosophers dared to openly condemn the cruelty woven into civic and household life. Why this silence? Partly because philosophy itself depended on leisure, the free time afforded by enslaved laborers. Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum existed in societies where slaves worked the fields, built the roads, and maintained the homes. To question cruelty too deeply was to question the foundation of the very system that made philosophy possible. The great ideals of virtue and reason were debated in spaces sustained by exploitation. There were voices of unease, though faint. Heraclitus, centuries before Plato, warned that strife was the father of all things, that human cruelty was inseparable from human order. His fragmentary writings suggest an awareness that law and violence were entwined. Tragedians like Euripides also offered indirect critiques. In plays such as The Trojan Women, he portrayed the suffering of captives, women and children enslaved after war, though not philosophy in the strict sense. His art questioned whether victory and justice could ever be clean. These voices remind us that not all Greek thought was blind to cruelty, though the dominant philosophical currents often looked away. The gap between theory and practice is most glaring when philosophers spoke of virtue. Plato extolled Sophrosyne self-control, and Aristotle praised phronesis practical wisdom. Both saw justice as a cornerstone of the good life. Yet, justice in practice often meant public whippings, mutilations, or executions carried out in the name of order. To call this virtue required a leap of reasoning that many philosophers were willing to make. They rationalized cruelty as necessity, or ignored it entirely, preferring to focus on abstract harmony rather than lived suffering. And yet, there is a strange power in their contradictions. Precisely because philosophers did not erase cruelty from their societies, we see the raw struggle between ideals and reality. Athens could build temples to reason while sentencing Socrates to death. Aristotle could analyze ethics while defending slavery. Plato could dream of perfect justice while prescribing corporal punishment. These contradictions force us to ask, what good are lofty ideals if they leave cruelty intact? The legacy of Greek philosophy is double-edged. On one hand, it gave us tools to think critically about power, virtue, and justice. On the other, it showed how easily intellect can become complicit, providing justifications for systems of violence. This is not unique to Greece. In every age, thinkers have wrestled with the temptation to excuse cruelty in the name of order, progress, or necessity. In the end, the philosophers' silence on cruelty may be their loudest lesson. It reminds us that wisdom alone is not enough. A society can revere logic debate, morality, and craft elegant theories, yet still allow the lash, the pit, and the poisoned cup. What is philosophy worth if it cannot confront suffering? In ancient Greece, the answer was often evasive. They left us brilliance, yes, but also a troubling inheritance. The reminder that ideals are only as strong as the courage to apply them to the powerless. Ancient Greece is celebrated as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, theatre, and art. The pillars of what we often call Western civilization. Yet beneath the marble temples and the words of Socrates lies another story darker and less comfortable. It is a story of engineered cruelty of punishments designed not only to kill, but to humiliate, terrify, and erase. To look at Greece honestly is to hold both legacies at once, the brilliance of ideas and the brutality of practices. The paradox is inescapable. The legacy of cruelty in ancient Greece is not erased by the passage of time. The brazen bull, the barathron, pit, the lash, the blinding iron. These were not accidents of history, but deliberate choices. They reflected a society that believed order could be secured through pain, that shame could be a civic tool as powerful as law. Even in Athens, where democracy flourished, execution and exile were often wielded as tools of political convenience. The trial of Socrates remains the most haunting reminder a philosopher condemned to death, not for violence, but for words. The method Hemlock administered calmly legally was not spectacular in its cruelty, but chilling in its civility. That tension between ideals and practice lingers as one of history's starkest warnings. What questions then do we ask of Greece? Should we measure its greatness by what it created, or by what it destroyed? For every dialogue of Plato, how many cries from the pit went unheard? For every marble column, how many backs bent under the lash? History tends to remember the philosophers and generals, but rarely the condemned who screamed inside the brazen bull, or the nameless moral offenders humiliated in public punishments. These silences are not accidental. They are part of the legacy of power which prefers glory to discomfort. Yet, archaeology fragments of law codes and the writings of playwrights and historians force us to remember. They make clear that justice in ancient Greece was not always noble. It was often performative, designed as much for the crowd as for the accused. To be punished was to be transformed into a lesson for others. Your pain, your humiliation, your death became part of civic theatre. In this sense, ancient Greece laid groundwork not only for democracy, but also for the spectacle of punishment that echoes through history. The modern parallels are unsettling. When states today parade criminals on television, or when prisons become industries profiting from labor, we see shades of the same logic: pain as propaganda, suffering as policy. Even the rhetoric of deterrence bears resemblance to the justifications used by ancient legislators. Civilization has advanced, yes, but the temptation to turn punishment into spectacle has never vanished. There is also the deeper question of memory. The Athenians designed the Barathron pit not only as a place of death, but as a place of forgetting. To cast someone into it was to erase their name, their body, and their story from the community. Yet, here we are, centuries later, still speaking of those deaths, still trying to recover their voices. History has a way of resisting erasure, of whispering back through bones, ruins, and half-forgotten texts. Every time we tell these stories, we undo in some small way the silencing intended by the punishers. The paradox of Greece remains the same society that gave us Socratic questioning also drank the hemlock in silence. The same polis that celebrated reason engineered punishments that mocked reason itself. Perhaps this is the truest legacy of Greece. Not perfection, but contradiction. They remind us that civilization is not a steady ascent toward virtue. It is a struggle, a tension between ideals and the realities of power. And so we return to the question: how do we measure a society's greatness? By its philosophers, its laws, its temples, or by the suffering it tolerated, justified, or ignored? Greece does not give us an easy answer. Instead, it offers a mirror. When we look at the Brazen Bull, at the blinding iron, at the pit, we are forced to ask, what cruelties do we still justify today in the name of order, deterrence, or necessity? The legacy of ancient Greek punishments is not only about the past, it is a challenge to the present. To remember the victims is to resist the erasure that power always seeks. To tell their stories is to ensure that their suffering is not reduced to silence. Memory itself becomes an act of justice. When history closes its ledger, the question remains: do we remember only the philosophers and the marble, or also the nameless who paid the price? To answer that is to decide what kind of civilization we wish to be. If you value the full record of history, both glory and cruelty, then subscribe. Because memory is resistance, and forgetting is the oldest punishment of all.